Thank you for coming. I appreciate your presence. And thank you for the Humanities Center for inviting me to do this.
Very welcome.
Basically, I do study colonialism, but that the historiography has changed substantially over the last couple of generations. We started out looking at the Western perspective, Western European perspective. We started taking the conquerors at their words when they reported their heroic actions. And then gradually we've shifted, questioning whether this was all of the reality or not. And now we're at a stage in Latin American colonial history in which I would think the great majority of works are now trying to view the encounter of the two worlds from the native perspective. And of course there were many native groups, so you cannot talk about one single perspective because of the difference in ethnicity. But what I find is that maybe there's a substructure to these different ethnic perspectives in terms of religious belief and ritual. And I've been working the north of colonial Mexico for quite a long time. I studied with writing the history of Saltillo, which was a modern-day city, but it started in 1577, and I talked about the Spanish construction of society there, including the labor systems, and that included the use of native human resources. The area that I study is basically below the United States border, and I study the northeast, which is right under Texas, the modern states of Coahuila, Nuevo León primarily, but I draw a lot of my information from across the north, Chihuahua, Durango, Sonora. And what we find in looking at this area is that this area has also been called arid America because of the dryness of the country, the scarcity of rain, and the need for dispersed populations to live on these limited resources. And as a result of that, when the Spaniards arrived conquering the Americas, they found that the area was populated by thousands of bands of hunters and gatherers who were living directly off the environment, harvesting the natural bounty, and with only a few modifications that was made technologically. And I call them, rather than hunters and gatherers, I still use that term, I tend to call them wilderness survivors. And, because wilderness survivors, that elevates their status versus hunters and gatherers are sort of like, they're just right above cattle, but wilderness survivors, now you...
It references the TV shows.
Yeah, exactly. It's, now you're a highly paid specialist, and you draw big bucks. And so if we had them still around today, we could actually, put them on TV and do echo tours and all kinds of stuff. But one of the major problems of interpreting their history is that, again, it was written primarily by the Europeans, and they did not have a written language, unlike the Aztecs or Maya. And so there's that problem. They did have pictographs on the rocks, and so we have to do a lot of the interpretation through Spanish sources. The other thing is that the Spaniards were very ethnocentric, Eurocentric, and so if somebody was not Christian or Spanish, that meant that right away they were immoral, inferior, and all kinds of other bad things that people get stereotyped with. And so the challenge was, for me, how to humanize the groups of people that I found struggling against Spanish colonialism. And because of their desert cultures and their level of social organization, and because the Spaniards could not move in enough numbers of people from central Mexico to really conquer the territory, they themselves sparsely settled the territory, the natives were able to carry on guerrilla warfare for hundreds of years. I'd say at least a couple of hundred years in the area that I'm talking about. In fact, I did an essay sometime in the past called Che Guevara on the North Mexican Frontier, in which I compare Che Guevara's manual on guerrilla warfare to the cultural practices of the nomadic hunters and gatherers. And he basically, in action, wrote the book before he found out what the secret was. But we have studied continually the history of missionizing, expeditions, mining, etc., and we now know, missing a few fine-tuned features, we now know the general picture of the material encounter with the natives. In other words, we know the labor systems, encomienda, repartimiento, slavery. We know some of the population trends. We know some of the mestizaje that took place. But the question was, what is there more? Because Westerners, and particularly modern humans, tend to adopt the negative attitude of these populations as having been primitive. Not only we consider their technology primitive compared to ours, we have the cumulative fund of human culture at our disposal. They were struggling simply to survive directly off the land. So we think of them as our early ancestors. Now we have evolved to a higher state of being. If we can argue that, I would argue that maybe we haven't evolved to a higher state of being. Our achievements have been mostly the accumulation of knowledge. And so in reading the documents of the military conflict and stuff, I began to notice a continual reference to something that the Spaniards called mitote. And in modern Spanish language, a mitote is simply a party. A mitotero is a rabble-rouser who starts parties or fun. And they said the natives practice this demonic ritual that we call mitote, and they're terribly addicted to it, and they keep going back to it, and they can't get away from it. And this is really ruining our plans to domesticate them, civilize them, and train them as good servants, because you can't count on them. They like to go party, but these are demonic parties, because if they're not worshiping Jesus Christ, they got to be worshiping the devil. And so what they notice is that this happened on a continual basis, and in fact the Spaniards eventually realized, okay, this is a regular pattern for them. When we want to track them down, we've got to find out where their mitotes are. So they would sort of figure out where the celebrations are going to be and go dragoon them over to bring them in to work on their haciendas and mines and other locations. So, and the Spaniards also realized that the mitotes seemed to be an activity in which they were organizing resistance against the Spaniards. So for religious reasons and for military reasons, logistical reasons, they decided we want to wipe this out, but they never could. In fact, in some cases, because they needed the native labor, and this was forced labor, semi-slavery, they used the word encomienda very frequently, but it was basically slavery or quasi-slavery. Because they needed their labor, they would actually allow the natives to carry on their demonic rituals on their own haciendas, on their own land. Because, rather have them do demonic dances and then go to work, than force them to go demonic dances somewhere else where we're going to have trouble getting them back. In resistance to Spanish domination, the natives kept their mitotes out in the woods, and then very frequently the Spaniards would complain, the men are coming into our households and stealing our female domestic servants, and the little kids that we raised as Christians, as soon as they can run, they run and do the mitote, and now we've lost that too. So this was the Spanish view, and from the chronicles and the reports of Spaniards dealing constantly with the natives, we know now, we have accounts in which they describe the rituals in detail. And basically what they found was that there would always be a big fire, a big bonfire,